In the early 1800s, a group of workers excavating beneath the ruined cloisters of a medieval monastery in central Italy uncovered a hidden stone chamber. Inside, they found a body, or what was left of one. The bones had been scorched, fused to the remains of a bronze framework that resembled a hollow bull. There were rivets around the base, a sealed latch at the belly, and beneath it all, layers of charred ash that once belonged to human lungs. It didn't take long for scholars to make the connection. The object matched historical descriptions, written centuries earlier, of a notorious execution device known only from legend, the Brazen Bull. According to records from the Greek tyrant Phalaris of Akragas, and later adopted into European folklore, this life-sized brass sculpture was hollow inside and fitted with acoustic tubes. The condemned were locked inside. A fire was lit beneath, and as they screamed in agony, the device turned their cries into the sound of a bellowing bull. For generations, the Brazen Bull was dismissed as myth, a gruesome allegory of tyranny. But here it was, buried, real, and stained with ash. The remains inside weren't those of an ancient Greek rebel. They were medieval, perhaps a heretic, perhaps a prisoner whose death was never recorded. But someone, centuries after Phalaris, believed this was still justice. Historians were stunned. The discovery raised unsettling questions. Who revived such an ancient horror in a Christian monastery? What sin could possibly justify a punishment that aimed not only to kill, but to humiliate and entertain? And why did no one write it down? This was not a simple tale of cruelty. It was a window into a worldview where pain was not a side effect. It was the purpose. A time when the body was seen as corruptible, sinful, disposable, and when authority, whether divine or earthly, could shape it with fire, iron, and fear. The story of this bull is not unique. All across Europe, archaeologists have found clues. Iron pears fitted with expanding petals, discovered in convent prisons. Skeletons with ribs broken outward like wings, suggestive of Viking ritual execution. And ink-faded court records describing torture chambers beneath churches, where sinners were purged through agony. Each case defies our modern sense of morality, but none of them were hidden at the time. They were public, legal, ritualized, approved. This isn't just about violence, it's about power. It's about what people in the past believed justice looked like, and what lengths they were willing to go to preserve order, obedience, or belief. We are about to examine three of the most sadistic execution methods ever devised: the blood eagle, the pear of anguish, and the Brazen Bull. Not as legends, but as part of a long, brutal tradition of punishment, one backed by law, religion, and public ritual. But before we dive into that darkness, we need to ask a more uncomfortable question. What kind of society needs to invent such punishments in the first place? And what does it say about us that so many of these devices were not only used, but proudly displayed? But before we jump right into it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But only if you enjoy what I do here, uncovering the dark side of history they never taught us in school. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to connect with all of you, my friends from around the world, as we journey deeper into the forgotten corners of the past. In the early 1800s, a group of workers excavating beneath the ruined cloisters of a medieval monastery in central Italy uncovered a hidden stone chamber. Inside, They found a body, or what was left of one. The bones had been scorched, fused to the remains of a bronze framework that resembled a hollow bull. There were rivets around the base, a sealed latch at the belly, and beneath it all, layers of charred ash that once belonged to human lungs. It didn't take long for scholars to make the connection. The object matched historical descriptions, written centuries earlier, of a notorious execution device known only from legend, the Brazen Bull. According to records from the Greek tyrant Phalaris of Akragas, and later adopted into European folklore, this life-sized brass sculpture was hollow inside and fitted with acoustic tubes. The condemned were locked inside. A fire was lit beneath, and as they screamed in agony, the device turned their cries into the sound of a bellowing bull. For generations, the Brazen Bull was dismissed as myth, a gruesome allegory of tyranny. But here it was, buried, real, and stained with ash. The remains inside weren't those of an ancient Greek rebel. They were medieval, perhaps a heretic, perhaps a prisoner whose death was never recorded. But someone, centuries after Phalaris, believed this was still justice. Historians were stunned. The discovery raised unsettling questions. Who revived such an ancient horror in a Christian monastery? What sin could possibly justify a punishment that aimed not only to kill, but to humiliate and entertain? And why did no one write it down? This was not a simple tale of cruelty. It was a window into a worldview where pain was not a side effect. It was the purpose. A time when the body was seen as corruptible, sinful, disposable, and when authority, whether divine or earthly, could shape it with fire, iron, and fear. The story of this bull is not unique. All across Europe, archaeologists have found clues. Iron pears fitted with expanding petals, discovered in convent prisons. Skeletons with ribs broken outward like wings, suggestive of Viking ritual execution. And ink-faded court records describing torture chambers beneath churches, where sinners were purged through agony. Each case defies our modern sense of morality. But none of them were hidden at the time. They were public, legal, ritualized, approved. This isn't just about violence, it's about power. It's about what people in the past believed justice looked like, and what lengths they were willing to go to preserve order, obedience, or belief. We are about to examine three of the most sadistic execution methods ever devised: the blood eagle, the pear of anguish, and the Brazen Bull. Not as legends, but as part of a long, brutal tradition of punishment, one backed by law, religion, and public ritual. But before we dive into that darkness, we need to ask a more uncomfortable question. What kind of society needs to invent such punishments in the first place? And what does it say about us that so many of these devices were not only used, but proudly displayed? But before we jump right into it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But only if you enjoy what I do here, uncovering the dark side of history they never taught us in school. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to connect with all of you, my friends from around the world, as we journey deeper into the forgotten corners of the past.
To understand how the most sadistic execution methods ever devised came to exist, we must first understand the world that produced them. Medieval Europe was not a unified land, but a fractured continent of kingdoms, duchies, and feudal territories, each ruled by a lord, a king, or a bishop. There were no human rights, no constitution, and no presumption of innocence. Power was absolute, and justice was not blind, it was deliberate, visible, and cruel by design. At the foundation of this society stood the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy of obligation and control. Land was power. Kings granted it to nobles. Nobles gave it to knights. And peasants, who made up over 90% of the population, worked it in exchange for protection. But this protection came at a price: obedience, labor, and silence. Above the kings, in spiritual authority if not in military might, stood the church, the moral anchor of the age. The church did not merely preach salvation. It interpreted divine law, collected taxes, and judged crimes. The bishop's word could override a noble's. A papal decree could declare war. And a local priest could condemn a soul, or a body, to purging by fire or steel. Justice, then, was not a system of balance. It was a tool of preservation, of the order, the hierarchy, and the divine right of rulers. Courts were held by nobles or clergy, and verdicts were often determined not by evidence, but by lineage, favor, confession, or superstition. Trials by ordeal, such as plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron, were thought to reveal innocence through miraculous survival. But for the vast majority, the peasants, the laborers, the widows, the foreigners, the outcome of justice was rarely in their favor. They lived under constant surveillance. Gossip could become evidence. Hunger could become theft. Speaking out could become heresy. Life was not only hard. It was uncertain. War between rival lords could break out with no warning, and with it came pillaging, rape, and scorched fields. Famine arrived with failed harvests, and when the food ran out, so did the mercy. Plague tore through villages, killing entire families in days. And childbirth, for both mother and infant, was a gamble often lost. In such a world, fear became order, and punishment became ritual. Public floggings, branding, and executions were not only legal, they were expected. They reminded the community of where power lived and how it was maintained. A man hanged for theft served not just as punishment, but as performance. A woman paraded through the village in chains reminded others to know their place. There was no anonymity, no privacy, and no appeal. Justice was not only about correcting behavior. It was about public obedience. The church reinforced this through doctrine. Sin was not just spiritual, it could be seen on the body, marked by deformity, illness, or misfortune. Suffering was sometimes interpreted as deserved. And the body itself, especially the body of the poor, the foreign, the sinful, was viewed as a vessel to be controlled, restrained, or purged. In cities, punishment became even more visible. Gallows were built outside the walls to greet travelers. Prisons were placed near markets. The condemned were tortured in front of crowds, and their bodies displayed afterward, a warning etched in flesh. The further you were from wealth or holiness, the closer you lived to danger. And this is where the darkest methods of execution took root. In this culture of submission, spectacle, and sacred violence, devices like the pair of anguish, the blood eagle, and the brazen bull were not seen as cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were seen as justice made visible, as fear made flesh. These devices did not appear in a vacuum. They grew from a system designed to control, to silence, and to shape behavior through fear and pain. They were part of a worldview in which power was inseparable from suffering, and salvation could only be earned through blood. The brutality of medieval punishment, then, was not an accident. It was a feature, one built into the foundation of a world where authority was absolute, and the human body was expendable. And for those who stepped outside the boundaries of that system, whether by choice, by birth, or by misfortune, the consequences were not only harsh. They were designed to be unforgettable. The legal systems of medieval Europe were not designed to discover truth. They were designed to enforce submission. And submission, in many cases, was extracted through pain. Law during this period was a tangled web of royal edicts, local customs, canon codes, and feudal decrees, rarely written, often contradictory, and almost always enforced by the powerful against the powerless. There were few formal lawyers. Judges were often priests or lords. And trials were less about facts than about public reinforcement of hierarchy and obedience. Justice began not with evidence, but with accusation. If you were accused of theft, heresy, blasphemy, or rebellion, the mere suspicion could begin the process. Guilt was not assumed, but neither was innocence protected. To determine the truth, medieval courts turned not to investigation, but to ordeal and confession. Trial by ordeal was as symbolic as it was deadly. A man might be ordered to walk over burning plowshares. A woman accused of poisoning might be made to drink scalding water. In some regions, the accused were tied and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were declared guilty, buoyed by the devil. If they sank, they were innocent, and dead. These practices were rooted in the belief that God would intervene directly. That divine justice would reveal itself through fire, water, or pain. But over time, ordeal gave way to something even darker: torture. By the 13th century, especially under the growing authority of the Church and the Inquisition, torture became institutionalized. It was no longer a side effect of punishment, it became part of the judicial process itself. Confession was considered the gold standard of proof. But if a suspect would not confess willingly, the court could authorize the use of devices to extract it. This process was recorded, regulated, and even blessed. The methods were brutal, methodical, and carefully staged. The rack was one of the most common. The accused was bound by the wrists and ankles to a wooden frame, and a system of cranks slowly stretched the body until tendons tore, shoulders dislocated, and muscles split. It was rarely fatal, because death ended the confession. The strappado involved suspending a person by the wrists behind their back, then dropping them abruptly. The impact shattered joints, sometimes severed arms from sockets. Some victims were dropped repeatedly for hours. The wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, was both torture and execution. The victim was lashed to a large cartwheel, then beaten with iron bars, shattering bones outward. Sometimes the wheel was spun, other times, it was hoisted up and placed on display, with the broken body still breathing. Flaying, the removal of skin, was reserved for traitors, rebels, or those who insulted the ruler. Strips of skin were peeled from the body while the victim was alive. In rare cases, the flayed skin was nailed to city gates or churches as a warning. Other methods included branding, crushing, and tongue removal, each tailored to the alleged crime. Blasphemers might be pierced through the tongue with a hot spike. Adulterers branded with a letter. Thieves had their hands amputated. Rebels were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their bodies dismembered while still alive, and their remains displayed across the countryside. But the use of torture was not random. It followed legal procedure, codified in many regions and documented in official records. Church courts, particularly during the Inquisition, kept meticulous logs of interrogations. These transcripts, preserved in dusty archives, record every scream, every pause, every final word, written down by scribes as if justice could be measured in agony. The public nature of execution was part of its purpose. It was not enough to punish. The punishment had to be seen. Townspeople were summoned to attend executions as civic and spiritual duty. Markets paused, bells rang, and children were brought to watch. Executions were staged with almost theatrical precision. The condemned were paraded through the streets. Confessions were read aloud. The instruments of death were cleaned and presented. Priests offered last rites, often within earshot of jeering crowds. Sometimes the victim repented. Sometimes they did not. Either way, their fate was sealed, and their body became a message. In some cities, executioners were official employees, paid by the crown, housed near the gallows, and often marked as unclean. In others, townspeople were forced to take turns carrying out the sentence. Justice, in this sense, was communal. And beneath all of it was a message: there is no power without pain. This message did not remain confined to the criminal. It extended to political enemies, religious dissenters, foreigners, and the mentally ill. It blurred the line between sinner and victim, between justice and vengeance. But the most chilling aspect of this system was its normality. Torture chambers were not hidden away. They were attached to town halls, monasteries, and castles. They were part of the architecture of justice. Children grew up walking past them. Markets were held within earshot. And no one questioned the right of the state or the church to shape the body, or end it. These methods, the rack, the wheel, the flaying knife, were not accidents of history. They were tools. Designed, improved, and replicated. And from within this machinery of terror, more creative devices emerged. Instruments that served no purpose except to humiliate, degrade, and destroy the human form in ways that lingered long after death. If medieval justice was built on hierarchy and obedience, then its cruelty was sustained by something deeper, belief. In the medieval worldview, the soul mattered more than the body. Earthly suffering, no matter how severe, was temporary. Eternal damnation was not. And so pain, even horrific, disfiguring pain, could be justified if it saved a soul, corrected a blasphemy, or protected the community from spiritual contagion. The Church taught that heresy was not just error. It was infection, a dangerous force that could unravel divine order if not eradicated. Heresy threatened the authority of Scripture, the stability of kingdoms, and the very salvation of others. And so, in the eyes of the Church, it demanded more than argument. It demanded elimination. This is what gave rise to the Inquisition, a coordinated system of investigation, interrogation, and punishment designed to root out false belief. Beginning in the 12th century and expanding rapidly across Europe, the Inquisition operated through tribunals led by Dominican friars and papal legates. These men were not rogue torturers. They were trained theologians, authorized by the Pope, and backed by state power. Accusations of heresy could be based on public behavior, refusing to attend Mass, reading prohibited texts, or denying the sacraments. But it could also stem from rumor, envy, or personal revenge. Once accused, the individual was summoned to confess. If they resisted, or if they confessed falsely, they were subjected to further questioning. And that questioning, more often than not, involved torture. Unlike secular courts, the Inquisition often used psychological tactics in addition to physical ones. Prisoners were kept in solitary cells. Light and sleep were withheld. Priests disguised as fellow prisoners encouraged false confessions. Some were told that their silence condemned others to hell. Others were promised leniency that never came. But when these failed, the tools of torture were brought out, legally, officially, and with scribes recording every moment. A woman in Toulouse was stretched until her shoulders came loose and her breath failed. A man in Cologne had his legs crushed with wedges for denying the real presence in the Eucharist. In Aragon, a priest was suspended by the wrists for hours for secretly preaching that salvation could be earned without the Church. Even when the condemned confessed, it wasn't enough. They were expected to repent publicly, endure penance, and often face execution anyway, especially if their ideas had already spread. But heresy was not the only spiritual threat. As the centuries wore on, witchcraft emerged as an even more terrifying enemy. Because it was invisible, emotional, and almost always gendered. The image of the witch, as we know it today, did not exist in early Christianity. But by the late medieval period, theological writings began to merge folk magic, paganism, and devil worship into a single, powerful narrative, that witches were agents of Satan, and that their rituals could cause real harm, to crops, infants, weather, or souls. In 1487, a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a manual that outlined how to detect, interrogate, and destroy witches. It claimed that women were more susceptible to the devil due to their emotional nature, weaker intellect, and carnal temptations. The book became one of the most influential texts in the history of Christian violence. The methods of witch hunting were terrifyingly efficient. First, a community would be gripped by fear: a failed harvest, a dying child, a cow that wouldn't produce milk. Then suspicion turned to a woman on the margins, elderly, unmarried, widowed, or outspoken. Accusations multiplied. Arrests followed. The accused were stripped naked and examined for witch marks, moles, scars, or birthmarks believed to be suckling spots for demons. They were submerged in rivers: float, and you were guilty; sink, and you were innocent but dead. They were tortured for confessions and for the names of others. In many towns, the process became cyclical. One confession led to 10 arrests. Panic spread. Trials ballooned. Executions became routine. Most witches were not burned, at least not at first. In England, they were hanged. In Germany, France, and Spain, burning was more common. Sometimes, the condemned were strangled before being lit aflame. Other times, they were burned alive, as a spectacle of purification. But not all victims of spiritual fear were heretics or witches. Others were punished through rituals of exorcism, in which mental illness, trauma, or dissenting behavior was framed as demonic possession. Young women who refused marriage might be whipped or restrained. Boys with seizures were chained in church basements. The afflicted were deprived of food, beaten with holy rods, or made to drink sacred substances, not to heal them, but to break them. The theology behind these actions was consistent: that evil could inhabit the body, and that violence could force it out. Suffering, in this logic, became a kind of sacrament. And these events were not hidden. They were written about in parish records, depicted in church art, and included in sermons. Entire communities witnessed them. Children grew up believing them. They were part of the spiritual atmosphere, dark clouds beneath the stained glass and incense. Today, the language of heresy and witchcraft feels foreign. But in the medieval mind, these were not fantasies. They were facts. Terrifying, invisible, and ever-present. And when people believe that evil hides among them, in women, in strangers, in rebels, they will accept almost any violence to feel safe again. If power in the medieval world flowed from the sword and the cross, then cruelty often flowed downward, onto those who had neither. And none were more vulnerable than women and children. Their suffering was not incidental. It was embedded in the structure of medieval law, religion, and custom. They were punished not only for crimes, but for stepping outside of the roles assigned to them, for being too loud, too free, too poor, too different. The legal status of women in most medieval societies was subordinate by design. In court, a woman's testimony was often considered inferior to a man's. In marriage, she was bound by obedience. Outside marriage, she was often treated with suspicion. Her body, her behavior, even her thoughts, all were monitored, regulated, and, when necessary, punished. One of the most infamous punishments was the scold's bridle, an iron cage fitted over the head, with a sharp metal plate forced into the mouth to prevent speech. It was used against women accused of gossip, nagging, or public defiance. Some bridles had bells attached, drawing the attention of townspeople as the wearer was paraded through the streets. It was not about correction. It was about humiliation, reducing the woman to an object of ridicule and fear. Branding was another common tool of control. Adulteresses could be marked with hot irons, sometimes with the letter E, sometimes with a symbol denoting their shame. The brands were placed on the cheek, the chest, or the inner thigh, places impossible to hide. These scars became lifelong sentences, visible reminders of dishonor in a world obsessed with virtue. Forced penance was a ritualized form of punishment reserved for moral crimes. A woman might be ordered to crawl through a cathedral on her knees, bleeding from flagellation. Others were made to wear humiliating garments, dunce caps, iron collars, or garments painted with symbols of their sins. These acts were witnessed, whispered about, and etched into memory. For poor women, punishment came even more swiftly. Accused of prostitution, they were whipped in public or had their noses slit. Those who bore children out of wedlock faced exile, forced service in convents, or death. In some towns, mothers who abandoned infants, even to save them, were buried alive, walled inside churches as a warning. But cruelty was not limited to adult women. Children, too, were subjected to harsh discipline, especially those seen as unruly, illegitimate, or unwanted. In many medieval cities, the death penalty was extended to minors. Children as young as 7 could be tried, tortured, and executed. The justification was theological: if a child could distinguish right from wrong, they could bear moral guilt. In 15th-century Germany, a 10-year-old boy was burned at the stake for heresy after being accused of mocking the Eucharist. In France, an 8-year-old girl was flogged and imprisoned for theft. Public executions of minors, though less common than adults, were not unthinkable, especially if the child was poor, foreign, or orphaned. Corporal punishment was routine. Schools, monasteries, and homes used rods, whips, and sticks. Beatings were often public and ritualized, part of a system designed to break the will and instill fear. Discipline was framed not as cruelty, but as love. To spare the rod, they said, was to spoil the child. But beyond punishment, children were also victims of systemic neglect and ritual abandonment. Unwanted infants, particularly those born outside marriage, were left at the gates of monasteries or on church steps. Some were taken in. Others died within hours. In cities like Florence and London, foundling hospitals emerged to collect these children, but resources were thin, and mortality remained high. In extreme cases, children were used in religious rituals. Some monastic records describe penitential ceremonies in which children were symbolically sacrificed, bound, paraded, or whipped, as stand-ins for the sins of the community. These were not always fatal, but they left physical and emotional scars. Girls faced even greater danger. From a young age, they were trained to obey, to endure, and to disappear. Those who resisted, who fought back, ran away, or spoke too loudly, were punished swiftly. Many were married off before puberty. Some were sold. Others vanished. Behind all of this was a system that treated the body not as sacred, but as malleable. The bodies of women and children were seen as vessels, to be controlled, corrected, or discarded. And often, these punishments were public. Executions were witnessed by crowds. Branding ceremonies were conducted in town squares. Whippings took place outside churches, time to follow Sunday, Massachusetts. Children stood beside their punished mothers, watching and learning. These rituals were not hidden. They were taught. The message was clear: obey, or be broken. The most terrifying aspect of these punishments was not just their pain, but their routine nature. They were ordinary. Accepted. Part of the fabric of daily life. When power is unchecked, and suffering is justified by theology or law, cruelty becomes invisible. It blends into the landscape: a scream behind the cathedral, a scar on a servant's face, a grave without a name. And out of this landscape emerged devices that embodied these ideas. Instruments designed to punish not just the flesh, but the dignity of those already without voice. The pear of anguish was one such device. Inserted into the body and expanded slowly, it targeted those accused of moral crimes, women who were labeled as liars, adulterers, or temptresses. Its pain was not random. It was targeted, a reflection of societal hatred masked as justice. In a world without microscopes, where disease had no clear cause and healing had no certain method, illness in the medieval period was not simply a matter of the body, it was a matter of the soul. Plague, madness, and deformity were often seen not as medical conditions, but as punishments from God, signs of moral failure, or evidence of demonic possession. And when fear took hold, cruelty often followed. The most infamous and devastating example was the Black Death, a series of bubonic plague outbreaks that struck Europe beginning in 1347 and returned in waves for centuries. The first wave alone killed nearly a third of the population. In some cities, entire neighborhoods vanished in a matter of weeks. Streets filled with corpses. Bells tolled without end. Families refused to bury their dead. The medical knowledge of the time had no explanation. Physicians speculated about bad air, unbalanced humors, and divine wrath. Treatments included bloodletting, burning herbs, or fleeing, if one had the wealth to escape. But flight did not cure fear. Instead, fear turned outward. Communities looked for someone to blame. In hundreds of towns across Germany, France, and Spain, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and bringing the plague upon Christians. These accusations led to pogroms, violent, state-approved massacres. Entire Jewish neighborhoods were burned. Men, women, and children were herded into synagogues and set alight. Others were tied to stakes and burned alive. These actions were framed not as vengeance, but as purification. In plague-stricken cities, the sick were often sealed inside their homes, left to die without food, medicine, or prayer. Entire families perished behind locked doors, not by disease alone, but by abandonment. The dead were buried in mass pits without names or markers, their bodies stacked and burned or covered in lime. Those who survived often bore psychological wounds. Many turned to religion with renewed desperation. Others embraced radical behavior, believing that extreme suffering could appease divine anger. One such movement was the flagellants, groups of men who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in the streets, chanting prayers, and calling for repentance. Their backs were torn open by iron-tipped whips. Their processions spread panic as much as piety. And though condemned by the church, their numbers swelled during each new outbreak. But not all suffering came from disease. Mental illness, trauma, and neurological disorders were poorly understood and often treated with violence. People who experienced seizures, hallucinations, or emotional instability were believed to be possessed by demons or cursed by witchcraft. Their behavior was not analyzed, it was punished. Those labeled as mad were sometimes locked in monastic cells, chained to walls, or left to wander as beggars. Others were subjected to exorcisms, which ranged from ritual prayers to physical abuse. The afflicted were beaten with crosses, forced to fast until starvation, or bound for days without sleep. Treatment methods varied by region, but most shared a common thread, the belief that suffering could cleanse. Some of the earliest attempts at surgery, often carried out by barbers or monks, involved drilling into the skull to release evil spirits. This practice, called trepanation, was performed without anesthesia. The patient was restrained, their scalp peeled back, and a hole carved directly into the bone. Whether it relieved pressure or merely added to the agony, no one could say. But it was done again and again, and sometimes the patient survived. Other common medical treatments included bloodletting, leeching, and purging, all based on the theory of balancing the four bodily humors. Patients were bled until unconsciousness. Bowels were emptied with herbal poisons. Cupping glasses were heated and applied to blister the skin. The idea was not to heal gently, but to force the body into submission. Women fared worse. Midwives and herbalists, often the only providers of practical care, were viewed with suspicion. If their remedies failed, or if they succeeded too well, they could be accused of witchcraft. Pregnant women were often left without skilled aid. Those who miscarried or bore stillborn infants were sometimes blamed for their own loss. In hospitals, there was little separation between the dying and the deranged. Beds were crowded. Sanitation was non-existent. Moans echoed through stone corridors. And while many monks and nuns offered care with genuine compassion, the environment itself was often more punitive than therapeutic. For the poor, there was no hope of treatment at all. Disease spread quickly through unwashed bodies, shared tools, and stagnant water. Injuries from labor or punishment went untreated. Infected wounds festered. Limbs rotted. People died in silence, and in numbers too great to count. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval medicine was how often it blurred into punishment. Plague victims were locked away not only to contain illness, but to separate the impure. The mentally ill were restrained not for their safety, but to display their possession. The disfigured were feared as omens. The disabled were paraded for coins or chained in town squares as warnings. To be ill in the medieval world was not just to suffer physically. It was to be feared, rejected, and punished for conditions no one understood. And through it all, the same principle returned: the body was not sacred. It was suspect. And when it failed, or broke, or behaved outside the expected bounds, it could be cut, bled, buried, or burned without question. In the medieval world, the line between religion and superstition was not clearly drawn. Faith saturated every part of life, from birth to death, but it also extended into the grave and beyond. It shaped not only how people worshipped, but how they bled, how they healed, how they died, and how they were remembered. Rituals of suffering were often modeled on the Passion of Christ. If the Son of God endured torment, then so could the sinner. And for many, inflicting pain, or accepting it, became a form of devotion. This belief was not limited to private prayer. It manifested in public rituals. Some of the most extreme were practiced by the flagellants, penitents who marched through towns during times of plague or war, beating themselves with metal-tipped whips, chanting hymns, and begging for forgiveness on behalf of humanity. Their blood stained the cobblestones. Their cries echoed through churches. And while the church hierarchy often condemned them as heretical, they were wildly popular among common people desperate for meaning in suffering. But rituals of devotion also took quieter, stranger forms. Across Europe, people sought protection and healing through relics, objects believed to carry the power of saints or martyrs. These included bones, teeth, pieces of clothing, drops of blood, or even the dust from a saint's tomb. Monasteries competed for these items, which were stored in ornate reliquaries and brought out during feast days or crises. People kissed them, touched them, slept beside them. Relics were thought to heal illness, protect crops, and ward off demons. But the hunger for relics created a market, one that was often manipulated. Forgeries multiplied. Pilgrims donated fortunes for fragments that may have been animal bones, old wood, or fabricated entirely. Even corpses became part of this sacred economy. Some saints were exhumed and divided, bones distributed to different churches. In rare cases, the heads, hearts, or tongues of holy figures were extracted and enshrined. These rituals were conducted with reverence, but the practice itself blurred the boundary between veneration and desecration. And it was not only saints who were treated this way. In some parts of Europe, criminals and heretics were subjected to symbolic mutilations even after death. A man hanged for treason might have his body burned, his ashes scattered, and his name erased from public records. Others were buried with heavy stones on their chests, to prevent resurrection. Some were buried upside down. Others had their hands bound or their mouths filled with earth or coins, to silence them in death. These practices were not random. They were rituals of control, designed to neutralize spiritual threats and reinforce social order. They were the final stage of punishment, carried out in the name of salvation. Burial practices themselves reflected the fear of spiritual pollution. The dead were segregated, saints in chapels, nobles near the altar, commoners outside the church walls. Suicides, excommunicates, and unbaptized infants were often denied burial entirely, their bodies left in unmarked pits or burned. Some towns believed in revenants, the dead who returned to haunt the living. To prevent this, corpses were decapitated, staked, or nailed into their coffins. In Eastern Europe, these beliefs gave rise to proto-vampire legends, not myths, but real fears acted out with hammer and spike. Superstition also shaped how people prepared for death. The wealthy commissioned elaborate tombs, painted murals of Judgment Day, or paid for masses to be said for their souls. Others joined religious orders as lay brothers or sisters late in life, hoping to die in holy service. Death was not a private matter. It was a public negotiation between body and soul, sin and salvation, memory and oblivion. Pilgrimages became acts of penance. People walked barefoot for hundreds of miles, carrying stones on their backs or wearing chains around their necks. Some visited shrines that promised healing. Others sought out places of suffering, to witness relics, to kneel in blood-stained chapels, or to confess sins at the site of a saint's martyrdom. For those who could not make the journey, churches sold indulgences, certificates that reduced time in purgatory in exchange for money, prayers, or acts of devotion. These were spiritual transactions, but they reflected a deeper truth. Salvation was seen not just as a gift, but as something to be earned, bought, or suffered for. Even architecture reflected this mindset. Cathedrals were filled with images of torment, demons devouring sinners, bodies flayed, souls falling into fire. These were not just artistic choices. They were warnings. To live in the medieval world was to be constantly reminded of death, judgment, and punishment, not only in sermons, but in stone, iron, and ritual. It is within this context that the most sadistic execution methods make their terrible sense. They were not invented by madmen. They were products of belief, created by people who saw the body as a battlefield for the soul. Devices like the Brazen Bull, the Pair of Anguish, and the Blood Eagle were not anomalies. They were extensions of the same logic that drove flagellants into the streets, that buried suicides outside the walls, and that opened graves to steal holy bones. Pain was not random. It was meaningful. And meaning, in this world, could justify almost anything. The Middle Ages did not vanish overnight. The practices, fears, and ideologies that shaped its cruelty did not end with the arrival of the printing press or the Enlightenment. They adapted, evolved, and, in many cases, intensified. Even as Europe entered the early modern period, torture remained legal and widespread. Inquisition tribunals expanded into new territories, fueled by colonial conquests and religious wars. The very same logic that burned heretics in medieval town squares was now exported overseas, to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, justified by new layers of dogma, commerce, and empire. In the 16th and 17th centuries, witch hunts escalated, reaching their most frenzied peaks not in the Middle Ages, but during the Renaissance and Reformation. Tens of thousands, mostly women, were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some were crushed with stones. Others were drowned in rivers. Many were burned alive in public squares, their cries recorded in parish journals and court transcripts. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch-hunting manual written in the late 15th century, continued to be cited long after its publication. Judges used it to justify torture. Priests quoted it in sermons. And neighbors used its language to accuse one another. The logic had not changed. Pain was still a form of purification. Execution was still a form of salvation, for the soul of the condemned, or for the community as a whole. Even beyond religion, the judicial systems of Europe retained medieval elements well into the 18th century. In France, prisoners were still broken on the wheel. In England, people were drawn and quartered for treason. In Germany, iron maidens and spiked chairs were displayed in local museums as both warnings and curiosities. Public execution remained a form of entertainment. A spectacle staged with drums, proclamations, and crowds numbering in the thousands. At the same time, new technologies and sciences began to reshape how bodies were controlled. Dissection, once forbidden, became institutionalized. Universities acquired corpses, often of the executed poor, for anatomical study. The same body that was once tortured in public was now dissected behind closed doors. But the power dynamic remained. Some lives were deemed worthy of burial, others of study. Some deaths were dignified, others instrumental. The language of punishment also shifted. By the 19th century, overt physical torture was increasingly seen as barbaric, especially in Western Europe. Reformers called for prisons instead of gallows, surveillance instead of public pain. But this change did not mean the end of cruelty. It meant a repackaging. Where medieval justice used whips and fire, modern justice used cells and silence. The panopticon, a circular prison designed for constant observation, became a symbol of modern control. Prisons multiplied. Chains were replaced with isolation. Punishment became internalized. The body was no longer broken in the public square. It was contained, managed, and forgotten. And yet, the devices remained. In castles, dungeons, and church basements, the tools of medieval execution were preserved. Some became museum exhibits. Others were lost, buried, or repurposed. But many were remembered, not as warnings, but as fascinations. The Brazen Bull was recreated in 19th-century textbooks as a curiosity of the ancients. The pair of anguish appeared in collections of torture instruments meant to shock Victorian audiences. The blood eagle, whether mythical or real, was revived in literature, films, and nationalist myths, a symbol of warrior justice, stripped of its original horror. And today, these devices circulate online, in listicles, reenactments, and digital reconstructions. They are often presented without context, their brutality exaggerated for clicks or entertainment. But behind the spectacle lies a real history, of pain, fear, and belief. What's often forgotten is that these methods were not hidden in their time. They were used by kings, sanctioned by bishops, written into law, and cheered by crowds. Their victims were real. Their wounds were real. And their erasure, the way they have been turned into trivia, is a second kind of violence. The legacy of medieval cruelty is not just in the tools it left behind. It is in the structures we still live with, prisons, courtrooms, hierarchies, ideologies. It is in the way society still determines whose pain is visible, and whose is ignored. It is in the comfort some find in believing that the past was worse. As if cruelty could be measured by the shape of an iron device, rather than the silence that follows its use. Beneath the ruined cloisters of a forgotten monastery, the remains still sat, fused to the inside of a bronze shell shaped like a bull. The bones were scorched. The iron frame had buckled slightly from centuries of pressure. The ash that collected at the bottom was so fine it had seeped into the cracks of the stone floor beneath. No marker had been placed. No name recorded. No ritual observed. It had been buried, not honored. Sealed away, not remembered. As if someone had wanted this object, and the person within it, to be erased. But it was not erased. It was found. And with it came questions that no clean narrative could answer. Who was this person? A criminal? A heretic? A political enemy? A scapegoat? A body offered in silence to satisfy some sacred order. And why was such a device, the Brazen Bull, used at all? Centuries after it had supposedly vanished from the world, why was it built again? Who forged the metal, sealed the latches, lit the fire? And what does that act tell us, not just about the people who stood around it, but about the society that allowed it to happen? There is a tendency to dismiss the past as a distant place. To believe that we have evolved, progressed, left behind the rituals of fear and public pain. But when we look closely, we see something different. We see that cruelty is never born from nowhere. It grows from fear. From power. From the need to control bodies, beliefs, and behavior. From the belief that suffering can correct, can purify, can protect the group at the expense of the individual. The blood eagle, the pair of anguish, the brazen bull, these are not just historical anomalies. They are symptoms of systems. They were built with purpose, used with pride, and then hidden when they no longer served the story the world wanted to tell. But the bones remained. History, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of resurfacing. Through ruins, through records, through the quiet work of those who dare to ask not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen at all. And so we end where we began, with a body turned to ash inside a hollow bronze animal. A human life, extinguished in the name of justice. A tool designed not to kill swiftly, but to destroy symbolically. A society that accepted it. A silence that followed. What does it say about us? Not that these things happened, but that they were forgotten. That so many were tortured, erased, and never named. That entire systems of punishment were built, dismantled, and then sanitized for textbooks and museums. We cannot resurrect the dead. But we can refuse to let them be hidden. This is not a story of monsters. It is a story of people. And it is not over. Because the past never really ends. It waits, in soil, in silence, in stone. Waiting to be unearthed. Waiting to be remembered.